The sun was setting over the Sea of Galilee, casting a golden hue across the water that seemed to stretch into eternity. I stood there, my feet buried in the sand, feeling the weight of the world upon my shoulders. My name is Ezra, a fisherman by trade, but today the nets felt heavier than usual, not with fish, but with the burdens of life. As I pulled the last net onto the shore, my thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of voices. Turning, I saw a small crowd gathering around a figure at the water's edge. His presence was magnetic, drawing people like moths to a flame. Curiosity piqued, I left my nets and moved closer, the sand giving way under my sandals. The man was speaking with a voice that carried both the gentleness of a shepherd and the authority of a king. His words, though simple, seemed to resonate with a depth that stirred something within me. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. Yet somehow I felt he was speaking directly to me. My heart, heavy with the daily struggles of providing for my family, began to lighten. Who was this man that could speak with such conviction, yet offer such profound peace? I watched as others around me were visibly moved, some with tears in their eyes, others with a newfound hope. He continued, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." His gaze lingered on a woman who had lost her child, her face etched with sorrow. She looked up, and for a moment it seemed as if the weight of her grief was lifted by his words alone. I found myself inching closer, drawn not just by curiosity, but by an inexplicable pull towards this stranger. His teachings were unlike anything I had heard from the Pharisees or the scribes. They were filled with compassion, a stark contrast to the rigid laws and judgments I was accustomed to. As I approached, I caught snippets of his discourse, each word like a balm to my weary soul. "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," he declared, his voice unwavering. The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and contemplation. My mind wandered to my own life, the endless toil, the debts, the fear of not catching enough fish to feed my family. This man's words seemed to promise something different, a life not bound by the daily grind, but by something more. Suddenly a commotion broke out at the edge of the crowd. A man, his clothes tattered and his face lined with the harshness of life, pushed his way forward. His voice was loud, desperate. "Teacher, my son is sick, near death. Can you help him?" The crowd hushed, all eyes now on this desperate father. The man, whom I now recognized as Jesus, the one they whispered about in the markets, turned his gaze towards the father. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a profound empathy. "Take me to him," Jesus said simply, and without hesitation, he began to follow the man. I felt a tug at my heart, an urge to follow. This wasn't just about healing a sick child. It was about witnessing something greater, something that could perhaps change the course of my own life. As I trailed behind, my steps felt lighter, my heart less burdened by the day's failures. The path led us through narrow streets, the houses close together, the air thick with the scent of cooking fires and the sounds of evening prayers. We arrived at a modest home where the cries of a child could be heard. The father's face was a mask of fear and hope as he ushered Jesus inside. I lingered outside, not daring to intrude, but close enough to hear the soft murmur of voices, the comforting words of Jesus. The crowd had dispersed, each person returning to their own concerns, but I couldn't leave. There was something about this moment, this man, that felt pivotal. As the night deepened, the cries from within the house quieted, replaced by a profound silence. My heart raced with anticipation and a touch of fear. What if this was all in vain? What if the child didn't recover? But then a different sound emerged, the laughter of a child, clear and joyful. The door opened, and the father stepped out, his face transformed by relief and joy. "He's healed," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. Jesus followed, his expression serene, as if this was the most natural outcome in the world. I stood there, my fisherman's hands rough and calloused, feeling something within me shift. Here was a man who could change lives with mere words, who could bring peace where there was despair. As I watched him walk away, I knew my life was about to change, not just by the day's catch, but by something far more profound. The next morning, the sun rose with a promise of warmth, but my heart was still wrestling with the events of the previous night. I couldn't shake the image of the healed child, the Father's joy, or the serene figure of Jesus. My usual routine of preparing my boat felt different, almost mundane compared to the miracle I had witnessed. As I pushed my boat into the water, my neighbor Levi, a tax collector known for his sharp tongue and even sharper deals, approached. His eyes were unusually soft, a stark contrast to his usual demeanor. "Ezra, did you see it?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. "The boy, healed by that man they call Jesus?" I nodded, my hands pausing on the oars. "Yes, Levi. It was beyond words." Levi sat down beside me, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking, Ezra. All my life, I've chased after wealth, power, but last night, it felt like I was chasing shadows. That man, he offers something real, something eternal." The sincerity in Levi's voice was new, and it stirred something within me. Here was a man who had everything the world could offer, yet he was moved by Jesus' compassion. "Perhaps we should follow him," I suggested, the idea feeling both bold and terrifying. Levi looked at me, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Yes, Ezra, we should. But you know how the Pharisees and the Romans view him. They're not pleased with his growing influence." His words were a sobering reminder of the political and religious tension in Galilee. Jesus' teachings of love, forgiveness, and humility were a direct challenge to the established order. The day passed with a heavy heart. My nets, once again, were light, but my mind was heavy with thoughts of Jesus. As evening approached, I heard rumors that Jesus was teaching again, this time near Capernaum. Without much thought, I found myself drawn there, Levi at my side. The crowd was larger this time, a mix of the curious, the desperate, and the devout. Jesus was speaking about forgiveness, his voice cutting through the evening air. "And if your brother sins against you, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him," he said, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, landing briefly on me. A woman in the crowd, her face marked by years of hardship, stepped forward. "Teacher, how can I forgive when my heart is filled with so much pain?" Jesus approached her, his touch gentle on her shoulder. "Forgiveness is not for the one who wronged you, but for you, to free your heart from the chains of bitterness." I watched, mesmerized, as her face softened, tears streaming down her cheeks. But then, a group of Pharisees pushed through the crowd, their expressions stern. "Teacher," one of them called out, his voice dripping with disdain, "you claim to forgive sins. Only God can do that. Are you blaspheming?" The atmosphere thickened with tension. Jesus, however, remained calm. Which is easier to say, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Rise up and walk"? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He turned to the woman. "Go in peace. Your faith has made you well." The Pharisees murmured among themselves, their faces a mix of confusion and anger. Levi leaned close to me, whispering, "This could turn dangerous, Ezra. They won't let this go unchallenged." Indeed, as Jesus continued to teach, the crowd's mood shifted. Some were inspired, others skeptical, and a few were outright hostile. I felt the pull of fear, the weight of potential repercussions. Yet looking at Jesus, his face illuminated by the setting sun, I felt a surge of courage. Levi and I exchanged a look, a silent agreement forming between us. We would follow this man, despite the risks. As the crowd began to disperse, Jesus approached us, his gaze piercing yet kind. "Follow me," he said simply. With those words, my life as I knew it ended. The nets, the boat, the daily struggle for survival, they all seemed trivial now. Here was a call to something greater, a journey not just of the body, but of the soul. As we walked away from the shore, the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential dangers, but for the first time in years, my heart felt light, filled with a purpose that transcended the daily grind. The journey with Jesus had begun, and with it, a transformation that would challenge everything I knew about life, faith, and myself. As we followed Jesus, the path led us away from the familiar shores of Galilee towards the bustling town of Capernaum. The air was thick with anticipation, and the weight of our decision to follow this enigmatic teacher hung heavily between Levi and me. The streets of Capernaum were alive with the usual evening activity, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Whispers of Jesus' teachings had spread like wildfire, igniting both hope and hostility. As we walked, I noticed the glances from passers-by, some filled with curiosity, others with skepticism or outright disdain. We arrived at a small courtyard where Jesus was to speak again. The crowd was larger now, a sea of faces, each one marked by life's trials. Jesus stood on a slightly raised platform, his presence commanding yet serene. His voice, when he spoke, carried a warmth that seemed to pierce through the growing darkness. "Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you," he said, his words floating over the crowd like a gentle breeze. The crowd murmured, some in agreement, others in disbelief. A man near the front, his face twisted with anger, shouted, "How can we love those who oppress us, the Romans who tax us to the bone?" Jesus' gaze was steady, his voice unwavering. "If you love only those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that?" Levi stiffened beside me, his past as a tax collector now a point of contention. I could feel his internal struggle, the conflict between his old life and the new path he was being called to walk. The tension escalated as a group of Pharisees, their robes marking their authority, pushed through the crowd. One of them, a man with a sharp, calculating gaze, stepped forward. "You speak of love, yet you disrupt the order. You claim to be a teacher, but your words sow discord." Jesus turned to him, his expression one of profound sadness rather than anger. "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." The Pharisee scoffed, "And what of the law? Do you not teach to disregard it?" Jesus replied, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." The Pharisee's eyes narrowed, his voice rising in challenge. "Then prove it, teacher. Show us a sign that you are indeed from God." The crowd grew silent, the air thick with expectation. Jesus looked around, his gaze settling on a man at the edge of the crowd, a man whose legs were twisted and weak, his eyes filled with a longing for something beyond his physical ailment. "Bring him here," Jesus instructed, his voice calm, yet carrying an undeniable authority. Two men from the crowd helped the crippled man forward, his body trembling with the effort and hope. Jesus knelt beside him, his hands resting gently on the man's legs. "Stand up, take your mat, and go home," he commanded. A gasp rippled through the crowd as the man, with tears streaming down his face, slowly rose to his feet, his legs straightening, his body gaining strength with each passing second. He stood, unsteady at first. Then, with growing confidence, he picked up his mat and began to walk, his steps becoming more assured with each stride. The crowd erupted in a mixture of awe, joy, and disbelief. The Pharisees, however, were not moved. Their faces hardened, their skepticism turning into a palpable anger. "This is trickery," one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the celebration. "He has confederates among us." Jesus stood, his eyes meeting the Pharisees with a piercing intensity. "Why do you harbor such doubt? Is it not written that the Messiah would come with signs and wonders? Yet you choose to see only what you wish to see." The tension was palpable, the air charged with the potential for conflict. Levi gripped my arm, his voice low and urgent. "Ezra, this is it. They're going to act against him." Just then, a Roman centurion, his armor gleaming in the fading light, pushed his way through the crowd. His presence was commanding, his face stern but not unkind. He approached Jesus, his posture one of respect rather than confrontation. "Teacher," he began, his voice carrying a hint of reverence, "my servant lies at home, paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus looked at him, his expression softening. "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion shook his head, his humility evident. "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." Jesus looked at the centurion, a smile of admiration touching his lips. "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And with that, the centurion, his face alight with hope, turned and hurried back to his home. The crowd, now buzzing with a mix of awe and confusion, watched as Jesus continued to teach, his words weaving through the night like threads of light. Levi and I stood there, our hearts pounding with the weight of what we were witnessing. The miracles, the teachings, the undeniable authority with which Jesus spoke. It was all so overwhelming, yet so compelling. As the evening drew to a close, the crowd began to thin, the night air cooling with the departure of the sun. Jesus turned to us, his followers, his gaze filled with a mix of compassion and determination. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.